Captain Sarah Martinez had served her country for 12 years, but as she walked through the corridors of Fort Harrison, she might as well have been invisible. The other officers barely nodded when she passed. In meetings, her suggestions were met with polite smiles and then ignored. When promotions came around, somehow her name never made it to the top of the list. It wasn't always this way. Sarah had graduated top of her class from West Point. She'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, earning a Bronze Star for her leadership. During a supply convoy ambush, she spoke 3 languages fluently and had a master's degree in military strategy. Yet here at Fort Harrison, a mid-sized base in rural Georgia, she was treated like furniture. The problem, Sarah knew, wasn't her record. It was Colonel James Hartwell, the base commander. Hartwell was old school, the kind of man who believed women belonged in support roles, not leading combat units. He'd made his feelings clear from her first day at Fort Harrison 3 years ago. Martinez, he'd said, looking her up and down like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. I see you've got quite the service record, but this isn't Afghanistan, this is peacetime operations, different skill set required. What he really meant was that she didn't fit his idea of what a leader should look like. Sarah was 5'4" with kind brown eyes and a quiet speaking voice. She didn't swagger or pound tables. She led through competence and care for her soldiers, not intimidation. The other male officers had taken their cue from Hartwell. Major Tom Bradley, who ran the logistics division, would interrupt her mid-sentence. In meetings, Lieutenant Colonel Rick Morrison made jokes about playing Army whenever she proposed training exercises. Captain Dave Fletcher, who everyone called Fletch, openly questioned her decisions in front of enlisted personnel. Sarah's unit was Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, a mixed group of administrative and support personnel that Hartwell considered the least important assignment on base. Her soldiers included clerks, mechanics, supply specialists, and medical technicians. Good people, but not the kind who would lead to career advancement. They gave you the misfits, didn't they? Her friend Lieutenant Jessica Chen had said over coffee one evening. Jessica worked in intelligence and saw how the base really operated. Hartwell's making sure you don't have a chance to shine. Sarah stirred her coffee slowly. My soldiers aren't misfits. They're professionals who deserve good leadership. You know what I mean, Jessica pressed. You should request a transfer. Get out of here before Hartwell ruins your career completely. But Sarah couldn't abandon her people, Sergeant. First Class Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who worked harder than anyone else on base. Corporal Tim Walker, a young man from rural Alabama who'd joined the Army to pay for college. Private Lisa Chang, fresh out of basic training and eager to prove herself. They deserved better than being written off. The breaking point came during the monthly commanders' meeting. Sarah had prepared a detailed report on equipment maintenance issues that were affecting base readiness. Several vehicles in the motor pool needed immediate attention, and the medical supply inventory was critically low. She stood at the front of the conference room, facing 24 male officers. Colonel Hartwell sat at the head of the table, checking his phone while she spoke. Sir, we have 14 vehicles that are currently non-operational due to parts shortages, Sarah reported. If we don't address this soon, it will impact our ability to respond to emergencies. Hartwell looked up briefly. How long have these vehicles been down, Captain? Some for over 6 weeks, sir. I've submitted multiple requisition forms, but they keep getting delayed. Major Bradley cleared his throat. With respect, sir, maybe if Captain Martinez's people were better at preventive maintenance, we wouldn't have this problem. Several officers chuckled. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, maintenance logs show my soldiers are exceeding Army standards for— I'm sure they are, Hartwell interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. Put together another report for next month. We'll see what we can do. That was it. No discussion, no plan of action. Just dismissal. Sarah gathered her papers and returned to her seat, aware that every officer in the room was either smirking or looking away in embarrassment for her. After the meeting, she walked back to her office in the Bravo Company building, a converted barracks from the 1960s that sat at the far edge of the base. Her soldiers were there waiting for her daily briefing, and she could see the questions in their eyes. They knew how these meetings went. They knew their captain was fighting an uphill battle just to get basic supplies, ma'am. Sergeant Gonzalez approached after the others had left. Any word on the parts for the Humvees? Sarah looked at the woman who'd served faithfully for 8 years, who worked weekends to keep equipment running, who never complained despite being passed over for promotion 3 times. "We're working on it, Sergeant." Gonzalez nodded, but Sarah could see the frustration. Her soldiers were doing their jobs with broken equipment and inadequate supplies, while other units got whatever they needed. It wasn't fair, and everyone knew it. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment off base, staring at a letter she'd started writing dozens of times, a transfer request. Jessica was right. She could get out, find a posting where her talents were appreciated. She had connections from her previous assignments, officers who respected her work, but leaving would mean abandoning her soldiers to whoever Hartwell decided to replace her with. It would mean letting men like Bradley and Morrison win. It would mean accepting that some battles couldn't be fought. Sarah crumpled up the letter and threw it in the trash. She'd find another way. What she didn't know was that her chance was coming sooner than she thought. 300 miles away in a crisis management center in Atlanta, emergency planners were tracking a massive hurricane heading straight for the Georgia coast. Hurricane Clara was strengthening rapidly, and computer models showed it making landfall in less than 72 hours. Fort Harrison was about to face its biggest test in decades, and every decision made in the next few days would determine whether Sarah Martinez remained overlooked, or finally got the chance to show what she was truly capable of. Hurricane Clara had strengthened to a Category 4 storm with winds of 150 miles per hour. The National Weather Service was calling it a catastrophic threat to the Georgia coast, and evacuation orders had been issued for 3 counties. Fort Harrison, located 60 miles inland, wasn't in the evacuation zone, but it would serve as a staging area for relief operations. Colonel Hartwell called an emergency meeting at 600 hours. The base conference room was packed with officers, their faces tense as they studied weather maps and emergency protocols. Sarah sat in her usual spot at the back, taking notes while Hartwell outlined the situation. "Gentlemen," Hartwell began, apparently forgetting that Captain Martinez was in the room. "We've got 48 hours to prepare this base for the largest disaster relief operation in our history. FEMA is coordinating, but will be the primary military response for the region." He clicked through slides showing projected storm paths, population centers at risk, and resource allocation plans. "We'll need to accommodate up to 5,000 evacuees in temporary shelters. Our motor pool will provide transportation for search and rescue operations. Medical will set up triage facilities. Supply will coordinate food and water distribution." Major Bradley raised his hand. "Sir, what about security for the evacuee shelters?" "Military police will handle primary security with support from—" Hartwell paused, glancing at his notes. "Bravo Company will provide additional personnel as needed." Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach. Additional personnel as needed. Translation: her people would be doing the unglamorous work that nobody else wanted while the other units got the high-visibility assignments. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison spoke up. "Colonel, we should prioritize getting our combat-ready units positioned for rescue operations. Alpha and Charlie companies have the experience for high-stakes missions." "Agreed," Hartwell nodded. "Captain Fletcher, I want your Alpha Company ready to deploy with the National Guard for water rescues. Morrison Charlie Company will handle evacuation transport. Bradley, coordinate all supply movements through your logistics teams." Sarah listened as assignment after assignment was handed out to other units. Search and rescue, medical response, supply distribution, communications, transportation. All the critical career-enhancing roles that would be featured in after-action reports and commendation recommendations. Finally, Hartwell looked in her direction. "Captain Martinez, Bravo. Company will manage evacuee processing and shelter maintenance. Make sure people have cots, blankets, that sort of thing. Keep them calm and organized." "Babysitting duty?" Sarah kept her expression neutral, but inside she was seething. Her unit had some of the most experienced logistics and support personnel on the base, people who could handle complex operations under pressure. Instead, they were being assigned to hand out blankets. "Sir," Sarah stood up. "With respect, my company has extensive experience in—" "I'm sure they do, Captain." Hartwell cut her off. "But in a crisis, we need people in roles where they can't make mistakes. Shelter management is important work." The message was clear. He didn't trust her with anything that mattered. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody spoke up. After the meeting, Sarah walked back to the Bravo Company building to brief her soldiers. They were already preparing for whatever assignment came their way, checking equipment and reviewing procedures. These were good people who deserved better leadership than what they were getting from the base command. "Listen up," Sarah called the company together. "We've got a major hurricane heading this way. The base will be hosting evacuees and we're responsible for shelter operations." She saw the looks that passed between her soldiers. They understood what shelter operations meant. It was make work, keeping them out of the way while other units handled the real mission. Sergeant Gonzalez raised her hand. "Ma'am, what about our maintenance teams? We've got mechanics who could support rescue vehicle operations. And our medics," added Corporal Walker. "We've got 3 certified EMTs who could help with medical response." Sarah felt a surge of pride. Her soldiers wanted to contribute, wanted to be part of something important. "I know, and I've noted those capabilities in my reports. For now, we follow orders and do our assigned mission better than anyone expects." Over the next 24 hours, Sarah watched the other companies prepare for their high-profile assignments. Alpha Company's vehicles were loaded with rescue equipment. Charlie Company practiced evacuation procedures. Medical units set up triage centers. Supply teams positioned emergency materials. Meanwhile, Bravo Company was tasked with setting up cots in 3 base gymnasiums and organizing registration tables. For evacuees, important work, Sarah reminded herself, but hardly the kind of mission that would demonstrate her unit's capabilities. The first evacuees began arriving that evening as outer rain bands from Hurricane Clara reached the area. Buses pulled up to the main gate carrying families with whatever belongings they could grab before fleeing their homes. Sarah watched from the window of Gym 2 as her soldiers efficiently processed each arrival, providing information, assigning sleeping areas, and distributing supplies. Private Chung was working with an elderly couple who seemed confused and frightened. The young soldier knelt down to their level, speaking quietly and patiently until they relaxed. Sergeant Gonzalez had organized the other evacuees into helping set up additional cots, turning the work into a community effort rather than a burden. "Your people are good at this," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Jessica Chen holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thanks. They're good at everything, actually. Just not getting the chance to show it." "You know," Jessica said, lowering her voice, "I've been monitoring communications traffic. There are some concerning gaps in the emergency response plan." "What kind of gaps?" "Coordination issues. FEMA's systems aren't talking properly with the state emergency management network. Local first responders are using different radio frequencies than the National Guard. And some of the shelters in the coastal counties are reporting capacity problems. They might need to send more evacuees here than originally planned." Sarah frowned. "Has anyone briefed Colonel Hartwell on these issues?" "I've sent reports, but you know how it is. Intelligence warnings tend to get lost in the shuffle during crisis operations." That night, as Hurricane Clara continued to strengthen offshore, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Jessica's warning about coordination gaps. In her experience, communication breakdowns were often the difference between successful missions and disasters. She got up and walked to her computer, pulling up the base's emergency communication protocols. What she found confirmed her fears. The plan assumed perfect coordination between multiple agencies that had never worked together before. There were no backup procedures if primary communications failed, no redundant command structure if key personnel became unavailable. Sarah had seen this kind of planning failure before in Afghanistan, operations that looked perfect on paper but fell apart the moment something unexpected happened. And hurricanes, she knew, always brought the unexpected. As she studied the protocols, an uncomfortable realization settled in her stomach. This wasn't just about her unit being given a lesser assignment. The entire base was potentially unprepared for what was coming. And when things went wrong, and Sarah was becoming convinced they would, someone would need to step up and fix them. The question was whether Colonel Hartwell would let her, or whether he would stick to his preconceptions even if it meant people getting hurt. Outside her window, the wind was beginning to pick up. Hurricane Clara was still 18 hours from landfall, but the storm's influence was already being felt. Sarah made a decision. She would prepare her unit not just for shelter management, but for whatever crisis might arise. Because she had a feeling they were going to need to be ready for anything. Hurricane Clara made landfall at 4:17 a.m. as a Category 4 storm. With sustained winds of 145 miles per hour, Sarah was in the Base Emergency Operations Center, officially there to provide updates on evacuee status, but really monitoring the overall situation as reports flooded in from across the region. The storm was worse than predicted. Storm surge had pushed 12 feet of water into coastal communities. Wind damage extended much further inland than the models had shown, and most critically, communications infrastructure was failing faster than backup systems could compensate. "We've lost contact with 3 county emergency operations centers," reported Captain Miller from communications. "Cell towers are down across the entire coastal region, and several radio repeaters have failed." Colonel Hartwell stood at the front of the operations center, studying displays that showed the storm's path and damage reports. His confident demeanor from the previous day was beginning to crack as the scope of the disaster became clear. "What about our rescue teams?" he asked. "Fletcher, what's Alpha Company's status?" Captain Fletcher looked up from his radio equipment, frustration evident on his face. "Sir, we can't raise them on primary frequencies. Last contact was 2 hours ago. They were responding to a water rescue in Millfield." "And Charlie Company?" Lieutenant Colonel Morrison shook his head. "Same problem, sir. They were running evacuation operations from a nursing home in Coastal Springs, but we haven't heard from them since the eye wall came ashore." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She'd feared this exact scenario. Units scattered across the disaster zone with no reliable way to communicate or coordinate. "The emergency plan was falling apart just as she'd predicted, sir." She spoke up from her position at the back of the room. "I recommend we establish a backup communications network using—" "Not now, Captain," Hartwell snapped, his stress evident. "We need to focus on re-establishing contact with our deployed units." But the problems were multiplying faster than solutions. Reports came in of additional evacuation shelters reaching capacity and needing to transfer evacuees to Fort Harrison. A dam upstream from one of the rescue zones was showing signs of structural damage. Medical facilities in 2 counties had lost power and were requesting emergency generator support by 8 a.m. It was clear that the original emergency plan was inadequate for the actual disaster they were facing. The base was receiving more evacuees than expected. Deployed units were operating without proper command and control, and new crises were emerging. "Faster than they could be addressed, Colonel." Major Bradley approached Hartwell's position. "We've got 12 buses incoming with evacuees from Millfield Elementary. They were supposed to go to the county shelter, but it flooded out. Where do you want me to put them?" Hartwell looked at the status board showing their 3 gymnasiums already at capacity. "I will have to." He was overwhelmed, Sarah realized. The man who'd spent years projecting confidence and control was freezing up when real leadership was needed, sir. Sarah stepped forward. "We can convert the base recreation center and 2 unused barracks buildings into additional shelter space. My people can have them ready in 2 hours." "Fine. Yes, do that," Hartwell said distractedly, then turned back to the communications board, where static-filled radio calls were coming in from various emergency responders. Sarah quietly slipped out of the operations center and jogged through the driving rain to the Bravo Company building. Her soldiers were there, waiting for orders and watching the storm through windows rattled by wind gusts. "Sergeant Gonzalez, I need you to take a team to the rec center and barracks 18 and 19. We're going to set up emergency shelters there. How fast can we make it happen?" "Give me 90 minutes, ma'am," Gonzalez replied without hesitation. "We've got the supplies stockpiled and ready to move. Corporal Walker, I need our mechanics and maintenance people to check the backup generators at all shelter locations. This storm is going to knock out power and we can't have people without heat or lights." "On it, ma'am." Private Chang, coordinate with the medical team. "We're going to have injured people coming in, and the base hospital is going to be overwhelmed. Set up a triage area in the rec center." As her soldiers moved into action, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years at Fort Harrison: the satisfaction of being truly useful. Her people were responding to real needs with competence and speed, while the base leadership struggled to adapt to changing circumstances. The next few hours were chaotic but productive. Bravo Company converted 3 additional buildings into functional shelters, complete with sleeping areas, food service, and basic medical care. They processed over 800 additional evacuees with efficiency that impressed even Sarah. Her soldiers worked tirelessly, moving supplies through dangerous wind and rain, calming frightened families, and solving problems as they arose. Meanwhile, the command structure continued to deteriorate. Communication with deployed units remained spotty at best. New emergency requests were coming in faster than they could be processed, and Colonel Hartwell was making increasingly erratic decisions, countermanding orders and changing priorities without clear reasoning. "Ma'am," Sergeant Gonzalez found Sarah during a brief break. "We've got a problem. The county emergency coordinator is asking for medical transport for critical patients from Coastal General Hospital. Their ambulances can't get through the flooding." Sarah looked at the request form. It required vehicles capable of operating in flood conditions, drivers with emergency response training, and medical personnel to accompany patients. Exactly the kind of mission that should have gone to Alpha or Charlie Company if anyone knew where they were. "What vehicles do we have available?" she asked. 3 high-clearance Humvees that were supposed to be in the motor pool for repairs. Corporal Jefferson got them running yesterday. And we've got EMT-certified personnel. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "Get the vehicles ready and brief the team. We're going to make that medical run." "Ma'am, we don't have authorization for off-base operations. Colonel Hartwell assigned us to shelter management only." Sarah looked through the window at evacuees settling into the shelters her people had created. Families who would have been sleeping in the rain if not for Bravo Company's initiative. She thought about the communications gaps she'd warned about, the coordination failures she'd anticipated, the leadership vacuum that was developing as the crisis exceeded everyone's expectations. "Sergeant, people are dying while we wait for proper authorization. We have the capability to help and we're going to use it." It was the moment Sarah Martinez stopped being the overlooked soldier and started becoming the leader her people and her community desperately needed. Sarah's unauthorized medical transport mission saved 17 lives. The high-water vehicles got through flooded roads that had stopped conventional ambulances, and her EMT-trained soldiers provided critical care during transport to hospitals, with power and functioning equipment. But when she returned to base 6 hours later, she found Colonel Hartwell waiting for her with barely controlled fury. "Captain Martinez, you directly disobeyed orders," he said, in front of the entire emergency operations center. "I specifically assigned your unit to shelter management. You had no authority to deploy off base." Sarah stood at attention, rain still dripping from her uniform. "Sir, we received an emergency medical request through proper channels. Lives were at stake. That's not your decision to make. We have procedures, command structure, proper authorization protocols, which weren't working, sir," Sarah interrupted, earning shocked looks from the other officers present. "We've lost contact with half our deployed units. Emergency requests are backing up because no one has clear authority to act. People are dying while we follow procedures that don't match the reality of this disaster." The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows and static from radio communications. Sarah had just done something unthinkable. She'd challenged Hartwell's leadership in front of his subordinate officers during a crisis. Hartwell's face flushed red. "Captain, you are relieved of command effective immediately. Report to your quarters and remain there pending formal disciplinary action." But before Sarah could respond, Captain Miller from Communications looked up from his radio bank with urgency. "Colonel, we just received a priority message from State Emergency Management. There's been a dam failure upstream from Millfield. Flash flooding is heading for the elementary school shelter where we have 300 evacuees." The color drained from Hartwell's face. "What? Which shelter?" "Millfield Elementary, sir. The same location where Alpha Company was conducting water rescues. We still don't have contact with Captain Fletcher's unit." Sarah's mind immediately went to work on the problem. Millfield Elementary was in a low-lying area that would be hit hard by floodwaters from the dam failure. The building wasn't designed as a storm shelter and would offer little protection. 300 people, including children, elderly, and disabled evacuees, would need immediate evacuation to higher ground. "How long until the floodwaters reach the school?" Hartwell asked. Best estimate is 90 minutes, sir. Hartwell stared at the situation map, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of organizing an evacuation under such dangerous conditions. 90 minutes to move 300 people, many with limited mobility, through floodwaters and debris-filled roads. It was exactly the kind of operation that required quick thinking, flexible planning, and experienced leadership. Sir, Major Bradley spoke up, we should contact the National Guard. This is beyond our current capabilities. The Guard is fully committed to other operations, Miller replied. They can't spare resources for at least 4 hours. 4 hours too late. Sarah watched Hartwell struggle with the decision. Knowing that every minute of delay made the evacuation more dangerous, she also knew that despite being relieved of command, she had the most relevant experience for this kind of operation. Colonel, she said quietly, I can get them out. Hartwell turned to her with anger still evident in his eyes. You're relieved of command, Captain. You don't give orders anymore. I'm not giving orders, sir. I'm making an offer. My people know how to move large groups of civilians quickly and safely. We've got the vehicles, the personnel, and the local knowledge to pull this off. Your people? You don't have people anymore, Martinez. I'm reassigning Bravo Company to... With respect, sir. Sergeant Gonzalez's voice cut through the discussion. Sarah turned to see her senior NCO standing in the doorway of the operations center, still in rain gear from setting up the emergency shelters. My soldiers want to know our orders for the Millfield evacuation. Behind Gonzalez, Sarah could see more of her soldiers gathered in the hallway. Corporal Walker, Private Chang, the mechanics, and medics and supply specialists who'd been working tirelessly for the past 12 hours. They weren't there by accident. Word had spread about the dam failure and the need for an emergency rescue. Sergeant, Captain Martinez is no longer your commanding officer, Hartwell said. Yes, sir, Gonzalez replied respectfully, but she's still our leader, and those people at Millfield Elementary need help right now. The distinction was subtle, but important. Commanding officer was a rank and position assigned by the Army. Leader was something earned through competence and trust. Sarah realized that her soldiers were making a choice about which one mattered more in this moment. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stepped forward. Colonel, we're running out of time. Whatever decision we make needs to happen now. Hartwell looked around the room at the faces of his officers, then at the soldiers of Bravo Company standing behind Sergeant Gonzalez. He was trapped between his need to maintain authority and the reality that Sarah's unit was the most capable force available for the mission. Fine, he said finally, but Major Bradley will command the operation, Captain Martinez. You're still relieved, but you can serve as an advisor to Major Bradley. It was a face-saving compromise that fooled no one. Bradley had never led an emergency evacuation and knew it. Sarah had, and everyone in the room knew that too. Sir, Bradley said quietly, I think Captain Martinez should take point on this one. She knows her people and has experience with these operations. Sarah felt a moment of surprise and gratitude. Bradley had been one of her harshest critics, but when lives were on the line, he was putting aside personal conflicts. 45 minutes to organize transportation, routes, and personnel assignments, Sarah said, already moving toward the door. Sergeant Gonzalez, get every available vehicle ready for passenger transport, Corporal Walker. I need road reconnaissance to find the safest evacuation routes. Private Chang, coordinate with base. Medical to prepare for potential casualties. As Bravo Company sprang into action, Sarah allowed herself a moment of realization. For 3 years, she'd been fighting for respect, for recognition, for the chance to prove herself. But respect wasn't something that could be granted by authority. It had to be earned through action. And in the next hour, as Hurricane Clara continued to batter the Georgia coast, Sarah Martinez was going to earn more respect than she'd ever received from Colonel Hartwell's approval. The real test was just beginning. The convoy of 12 vehicles left Fort Harrison at 2:47 p.m., racing against floodwaters that were rushing toward Millfield Elementary School. Sarah rode in the lead Humvee with Sergeant Gonzalez driving and Corporal Walker navigating using reconnaissance. Reports from advance teams behind them. Trucks and personnel carriers carried evacuation supplies and 43 soldiers from Bravo Company. The storm was still fierce, with winds gusting over 80 miles per hour and rain falling so hard that Visibility was limited to a few car lengths. Debris covered the roads. Fallen trees, roof panels, power lines, and abandoned vehicles. Walker called out obstacles while Gonzalez maneuvered around them with practiced skill. "Ma'am, latest report from base shows floodwaters have reached Highway 92, Walker reported. That's our planned primary route out of Millfield. Sarah studied the map on her tablet, calculating alternatives. What about County Road 15? It runs along higher ground. Checking with recon team now. Walker switched radio frequencies. Corporal Martinez, this is Walker. What's the status on County Road 15? Over. The response crackled through with static. Walker, this is Martinez. Road is passable, but trees down in 3 locations. We're clearing what we can, but you'll need the big trucks to push through. Over. Copy that. ETA to school? 15 minutes out, ma'am, Gonzalez replied, downshifting to navigate around an overturned delivery truck. Sarah's radio buzzed with an incoming transmission from base. Rescue leader, this is base operations. Flash flood has reached the school. Perimeter. Water is rising in the parking lot and basement areas. How copy? Sarah keyed her microphone. Base operations rescue leader copies. What's current status of evacuees? They've moved everyone to the 2nd floor, but water is entering the 1st floor rapidly. You've got maybe 30 minutes before the building is compromised. 30 minutes to evacuate 300 people, including elderly evacuees in wheelchairs, families with small children, and individuals with medical conditions requiring special assistance. Under normal conditions, it would be challenging. In hurricane winds with rising floodwater, it was nearly impossible. Sergeant Gonzalez, can we make it in 20 minutes? Yes, ma'am, but it's going to be rough. They pushed through the storm, their convoy weaving between obstacles and occasionally having to backtrack when roads became impassable. Sarah used the time to coordinate with her teams via radio, assigning specific responsibilities for different groups of evacuees and establishing loading priorities for the most vulnerable individuals. When they reached Millfield Elementary, the scene was worse than Sarah had expected. The school building sat in 3 feet of muddy water that was still rising. The parking lot had become a lake, and the main entrance was completely flooded. Emergency vehicles from earlier rescue operations sat abandoned in the water, unable to operate in the conditions, ma'am. How do we get the vehicles close enough to load evacuees? Walker asked. Sarah surveyed the situation, her mind working through options. The school had a 2nd-story emergency exit that led to a fire escape, but it was on the opposite side of the building from the parking lot. The playground area on higher ground might be accessible, but it would require evacuees to wade through chest-deep water to reach the vehicles. There, she pointed to a delivery dock on the school's north side. The loading dock is elevated and has a ramp. If we can get vehicles backed up to that platform, we can load directly without putting people in the water. But reaching the loading dock meant driving through a flooded service road with unknown obstacles beneath the water's surface. One vehicle getting stuck could trap the entire convoy. I'll take the lead vehicle through, Gonzalez said. Test the route and mark any obstacles. Negative, Sergeant. Too dangerous for one vehicle. We'll do it as a convoy with safety lines. Between vehicles, Sarah coordinated the complex maneuver, using hand signals and radio communication to guide her vehicles through the floodwater to the school's loading dock. The water was deeper than it looked, at times reaching nearly to the truck beds, but Gonzalez's driving skills and Walker's navigation got them through safely. The school's loading dock was crowded with evacuees who'd been waiting for rescue for hours. Elderly individuals in wheelchairs, parents holding crying children, teenagers helping carry supplies. They looked exhausted and frightened, but when they saw the military vehicles arriving, Sarah could see hope replacing despair on their faces. Listen, up, Sarah called to her soldiers as they deployed from the vehicles. Priority loading, medical cases first, then elderly and disabled, then families with small children. Everyone else loads by groups of 20. Corporals Jefferson and Martinez, you're responsible for vehicle loading and securing passengers. Sergeant Williams, establish a perimeter and keep watch for rising water levels. The evacuation proceeded. With military efficiency despite the challenging conditions, Sarah's soldiers moved through the crowd, identifying priority evacuees and organizing loading groups. They helped wheelchair-bound individuals into vehicles, secured car seats for small children, and provided calm reassurance to frightened families. "Ma'am," Private Chang approached with a medical report. "We've got one elderly gentleman with chest pains and a woman in early labor. They need immediate medical attention. Get them in the lead vehicle with our EMT team. We'll transport them directly to the hospital." 25 minutes after arriving, they had loaded 287 evacuees into their vehicles, but water was still rising, and Sarah could see that the loading dock would be underwater within minutes. "Final count," she called. "Out. Are we missing anyone?" "Ma'am," called out Corporal Jefferson from the school building. "The principal says there are 13 more people in the basement shelter who can't get up the stairs. The stairwell is flooded, but they're trapped in an air pocket." Sarah felt her heart sink. 13 people trapped in a flooding basement with no easy way to reach them. The smart military decision would be to evacuate the 287 people they'd already loaded and report the others as casualties beyond their capability to rescue. But Sarah had never been willing to accept casualties when alternatives existed. "Sergeant Gonzalez, get the convoy moving, transport all evacuees to Fort Harrison. Corporal Walker Jefferson Chang, you're with me. We're going after the 13. "Ma'am, the water's too deep now. We don't have diving equipment. We'll find a way." No one gets left behind. As the convoy pulled away with nearly 300 rescued evacuees, Sarah and her small team prepared for the most dangerous rescue of their careers. The floodwater was now 4 feet deep around the school building and rising fast. But somewhere below them, 13 people were counting on soldiers they'd never met to risk everything for their lives. This was the moment that would define not just Sarah's career, but her understanding of what leadership really meant. The basement of Millfield Elementary School was a maze of flooded hallways and submerged classroom doors. Sarah and her team waded through chest-deep water, using waterproof flashlights to navigate in the darkness. The principal, Mr. Davis, had insisted on coming with them despite the danger. "The shelter is in the old bomb shelter from the 1960s, Davis explained, his voice echoing in the flooded corridor. "Reinforced concrete walls, one entrance. They've got air for maybe another hour, but if the water rises much more..." Sarah understood. The 13 people trapped in the shelter, a mix of school custodial staff and evacuees who'd taken refuge in what they thought was the safest part of the building, would either drown or suffocate if they couldn't be reached soon. "How far to the shelter entrance?" she asked. "About 30 meters down this hallway, then left to the maintenance area." Corporal Walker, who'd been measuring water depth, looked up with concern. "Ma'am, water's rising about 6 inches every 10 minutes. At this rate, the shelter entrance will be completely submerged in 20 minutes. Sarah did the math in her head. Even if they reached the shelter, they'd need time to break through the steel door, organize the evacuation, and guide 13 people back through flooded corridors to safety. It was going to be close. "Corporal Jefferson, what tools do we have for opening that door?" "Crowbars, bolt cutters, and a small cutting torch that might work underwater for a few minutes," Jefferson replied, holding up a waterproof equipment bag. They pressed forward through the rising water, feeling their way along walls as debris floated past them in the current. The school's emergency lighting had failed hours ago, leaving them dependent on their flashlights and the eerie glow reflecting off the floodwater. When they reached the maintenance area, Sarah could see the shelter door, a heavy steel barrier with fallout shelter painted in faded letters. Water was already lapping at the bottom edge, and she could hear voices on the other side. "Hello?" she called out, pounding on the door. "This is Captain Martinez with the U.S. Army. We're here to get you out." A muffled voice responded from inside. "Thank God! We've got 13 people in here, including 2 kids and an elderly man with a heart condition." Corporal Jefferson was already working on the door's locking mechanism with his cutting torch. Sparks flew underwater as he worked to cut through the steel bolt, but the torch was losing power rapidly in the flooded conditions. "Ma'am," Walker called out urgently, "water level has risen another 4 inches. We've got maybe 15 minutes before this corridor is completely underwater." Sarah looked at the partially cut bolt, then at her soldiers working desperately to open the door. 15 minutes wasn't enough time to cut through, evacuate 13 people, and guide them back to safety through flooded hallways. They needed a different approach. "Mr. Davis, are there any other ways out of this area? Emergency exits, service tunnels, anything?" The principal thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. "The old coal chute. It leads from the basement directly to the playground. We sealed it years ago, but if we could break through... Where is it? 2 classrooms down from the shelter, but ma'am, it's been sealed with concrete blocks. Sarah made a command decision. Jefferson, Walker, keep working on this door, Chang. Davis, show me the coal chute. We'll create 2 ways out. The coal chute was exactly where Davis had indicated. A sloped concrete tunnel that had once carried coal from delivery trucks down to the school's old furnace room. The opening had been bricked up with concrete blocks, but Sarah could see that the mortar was old and crumbling. Chang, can we break through this? Private Chung examined the wall with her flashlight. Yes, ma'am, but it'll take time and make a lot of noise. Do it, and hurry. While Chung worked on breaking through the coal chute, Sarah heard Jefferson's voice echoing down the hallway. Got it. Doors open. She rushed back to find Jefferson and Walker helping evacuees out of the shelter. The 13 trapped people emerged blinking into the dim light of the flooded corridor. Custodial staff who'd been working late, a family with 2 young children, who'd taken shelter in what they thought was the safest place, and an elderly maintenance worker who was having trouble breathing. Everyone stay calm, Sarah instructed. We're going to guide you to safety, but the water is deep and the current is strong. Hold on to the person in front of you and don't let go. But as they began organizing the evacuation, Walker grabbed Sarah's arm. Ma'am, we've got a problem. Water level at the main exit has risen too high. I don't think we can get everyone back. The way we came, especially the kids and the elderly gentlemen. Sarah's heart sank, but then she heard Chang's voice from the direction of the coal chute. Ma'am, I've broken through. We've got an alternate exit. The coal chute was a tight fit, especially for adults, but it led directly to higher ground near the playground. Sarah organized the evacuation with military precision. Children first, then elderly and injured, then the remaining adults. Her soldiers assisted each person through the narrow passage, ensuring no one got stuck or injured during the climb. She went last, making sure everyone else was safely out before following them up the coal chute. When she emerged onto the playground, she found her team organizing the rescued evacuees and preparing to signal for pickup by the remaining vehicles. From her convoy, all 13 accounted for, ma'am, Sergeant Gonzalez reported. She'd returned with 2 vehicles to pick up Sarah's team and the final evacuees. Medical team says the elderly gentleman is stable but needs hospital attention. As they loaded the last evacuees into vehicles, Sarah looked back at Millfield Elementary School. The building was now surrounded by 6 feet of flood water, with only the 2nd story visible above the muddy lake that had engulfed the area. If they'd been 30 minutes later, or if she'd followed protocol and waited for authorization, 13 people would have died in that basement shelter. The convoy made its way back to Fort Harrison through clearing skies. Hurricane Clara had moved inland, and while damage was extensive, the immediate danger was over. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, exhausted but satisfied. Her soldiers had performed magnificently under impossible conditions, saving over 300 lives in one of the most successful disaster relief operations in Fort Harrison's history. But as they approached the base gates, Sarah realized her personal battle was far from over. She directly disobeyed orders, challenged her commanding officer's authority, and essentially led a mutiny against established command structure. Military justice would have to be satisfied, regardless of the successful outcome. Colonel Hartwell was waiting for her in the base operations center, along with several officers she didn't recognize, investigators from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, and representatives from higher headquarters who'd arrived to assess the base's disaster response. Captain Martinez, Hartwell, began formally. You will report for disciplinary hearing at 800 tomorrow regarding your unauthorized actions during emergency operations. But before Sarah could respond, one of the visiting officers stepped forward. Colonel Hartwell, I'm Major General Patricia Williams from Army Emergency Response Command. I've been monitoring Fort Harrison's disaster response operations, and I need to speak with Captain Martinez immediately. Sarah came to attention. Yes, ma'am. Captain, I've reviewed the after-action reports from your evacuation operations today. In my 28 years of military service, I've rarely seen such effective leadership under crisis conditions. You saved over 300 civilian lives, while other units were unable to complete their assigned missions due to communication failures and inadequate planning. General Williams turned to address Colonel Hartwell. "Colonel, I'm recommending Captain Martinez for the Soldier's Medal for heroism involving voluntary risk of life under conditions not involving conflict with an enemy. I'm also recommending her for immediate promotion to Major and assignment as this base's new Deputy Commander for Emergency Operations." The room fell silent. Sarah felt the world shift around her as she realized what was happening. 3 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated had culminated in this moment of complete vindication. Furthermore, General Williams continued, "I'm ordering a complete review of Fort Harrison's emergency response procedures and command structure. Captain Martinez's unit was the only one that successfully completed all assigned missions during this crisis, which suggests that either she's exceptional or the rest of your leadership structure needs significant improvement." Colonel Hartwell's face had gone pale. "General, with respect, Captain Martinez disobeyed direct orders. She saved lives while following the spirit of military doctrine, even when the letter of regulations proved inadequate," Williams interrupted. "That's exactly the kind of leadership we need in crisis situations." Sarah felt 3 years of frustration and anger dissolving into something like justice, not revenge. She'd never wanted to hurt anyone, but recognition that competence and character mattered more than politics and prejudice. "Sir," she addressed Colonel Hartwell directly, "I never wanted to undermine your authority. I just wanted the chance to serve effectively and take care of my soldiers. They deserved better leadership than they were getting, and the people we're sworn to protect deserved our best efforts." Hartwell looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Captain, Major Martinez, I owe you an apology and an explanation." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I spent so many years in units where leadership meant command and control, where questioning authority was seen as weakness. I never learned to recognize quiet competence or collaborative leadership. I was wrong about you, and my prejudice could have cost lives today." It wasn't a complete transformation. Decades of institutional bias couldn't be erased in one conversation, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that leadership came in many forms and that the Army's future depended on recognizing and developing all of them. 6 months later, Major Sarah Martinez stood in the same conference room where she'd once been dismissed and ignored. But now she was briefing a room full of senior officers on new emergency response protocols, based on lessons learned from Hurricane Clara. Her recommendations were being implemented across the entire southeastern region, and requests for her expertise were coming from emergency management agencies nationwide. Sergeant Gonzalez, now Sergeant First Class Gonzalez, served as her senior enlisted advisor. Corporal Walker had been accepted for officer candidate school. Private Chung was completing advanced medical training. The soldiers of Bravo Company, no longer called misfits by anyone, had become the model for multi-capable support units throughout the Army, and Colonel Hartwell, to his credit, had requested additional leadership training and was working to create a more inclusive command environment at Fort Harrison. Change was slow, but it was happening. Sarah had learned that being overlooked wasn't always about being inadequate. Sometimes it was about others being unable to see past their own limitations. Real leadership wasn't about demanding respect or fighting for recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done, taking care of your people, and being ready when the moment came to prove yourself. She'd spent years trying to fit into other people's idea of what a leader should look like. But Hurricane Clara had taught her that the best leaders were often the ones who looked different, thought differently, and led from quiet competence rather than loud authority. The storm had revealed who she really was, not the soldier they'd always overlooked, but the leader they'd always needed, and in the end, that made all the difference.